I think we had a very interesting morning with both the comments from Mr. Ford from AFRICOM and also the first panel to sort of lay some foundational, just lay a framework, or at least lay some alternative frameworks out there for discussing the issue of foreign fighters or foreign trained fighters this morning. So this afternoon, actually, we're moving into the case studies of the conference title. And this afternoon, we'll have the two African-centric case studies. The first one here is Somalia, and then later on today, we'll have the Maghreb case study. I think we have an excellent panel assembled here today. We have Ambassador David Shin, who wrote a paper on this. It's quite excellent. Once he's finished doing some, I think you've already done a second draft on it, so that'll be disseminated at a later point in time. Ambassador Shin is currently a adjunct professor at George Washington University, and he actually is teaching a class today, so I promised him that we'll conclude this panel by 3 p.m. Ambassador Shin had a long service in the United States Foreign Service. Among some of his more notable assignments, he was ambassador to Ethiopia. He was also a director of East Africa and Horn of African Affairs. Previously to that, during the Somalia intervention of the early 1990s, he was the State Department's Deputy Task Force Director on Somalia. To his right is Ted Dagney. He is a longtime analyst of East African affairs with many publications and quite a good background there. To his left is David Gartenstein. Please correct me if I mispronounce, but Gartenstein-Ross. Okay. He has written some very interesting work. One of his books was, I misplaced the title here. I'm not sure it's mentioned in your... My Year Inside Radical Islam. He's also written a big piece in the Middle East Quarterly on al-Shabaab. And last but not least, we have Professor Ken Menkhaus from Davidson College. He's also written extensively on Somalia and on the Horn of Africa. So without further ado, Ambassador Shin.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm going to basically summarize a considerably longer paper that I have done on the issue of foreign fighters in Somalia. I should make one caveat from the outset. There are some Somalis who would argue, perhaps with me, with my definition of foreign fighters. I'm going to focus exclusively on foreign fighters with al-Shabaab. But there, of course, are other elements that have or still are engaged in Somalia who are fighting and who are foreigners. You had large Ethiopian forces in there at one time, clearly foreigners, and you have today African Union forces from Burundi and Uganda who are there under the aegis of the transitional federal government, the African Union, the UN, etc. But they too are foreign. But I'm not talking about them. I'm only talking about al-Shabaab today. So if you disagree with my definition, bear with me. I wanted to say a few words about some of the earlier background of foreign fighters, or at least extremist Islamic influence in Somalia. And the problem, in one sense, started with the collapse of the Somali state, the collapse of the Siad Barre government in 1991, when you had a total state failure, which, for all practical purposes, exists until the present day. In fact, the extremist element, or at least that element of Islam that was un-Somali in its formation, began earlier than that, in that you had a small number of Somalis who had interaction with the Salafi Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and also with the Wahhabi teachings in Saudi Arabia. And those two elements probably created the very beginnings of what we now call the extremist influence in Somalia today. In terms of an organizational link to these early attempts, I'm going to skip over several of them. The most important one formed officially in 1982 1992, and that was Al-Ittihad al-Islami, also known as the Islamic Union, which actually engaged in an effort to rally around some of the extremist elements in Somalia, but even carried out a few terrorist attacks inside Ethiopia. This coincided with the move of Osama bin Laden to Khartoum, end of 1992, and that in and of itself was not significant, except for the fact that he took with him one of his most talented and trusted lieutenants, Abu Hafs al-Masri, who was given the task of trying to build up an al-Qaeda element in Somalia. Al-Hafs made a number of trips to Somalia in the very early 1990s, beginning in 1992, operating out of the then al-Qaeda headquarters in Khartoum. The first al-Qaeda operatives actually appeared in Somalia in February of 1993. They had close contact with Al-Ittihad al-Islami, who sort of served as their hosts, as it were, and the al-Qaeda folks thought they were off and running at that time. Now, this is all happening at a time when international involvement in Somalia is really picking up steam. You had the UN effort, you had the UNITAF, US-led effort, and quite frankly, I was part of that, both of those efforts. We didn't even know about al-Qaeda in Somalia at that time. In fact, al-Qaeda was almost an unknown name back in 92 and 93. Nevertheless, with the benefit of documents that have been captured since then, al-Qaeda documents, it's very, very clear that they were active in the area. The problem, though, is that al-Qaeda thought that this was going to be an easy touch, that the Somalis were ripe for being swayed to their point of view, that there was such a chaotic situation there that it would not be difficult to create jihadi followers. And they learned fairly quickly that recruiting Somalis to the jihadi cause was a far more difficult task than they had thought. And in fact, they ended up concluding that their early efforts in Somalia had more adversity than they had success. And it was frankly a bit of a setback for al-Qaeda, that things did not go as well as they thought. They got played just like everyone else gets played in Somalia. Moving forward, though, in terms of what's going on in the Horn of Africa, al-Qaeda did manage during this early effort to recruit a handful of Somalis who agreed with their philosophical beliefs. These folks hung around and ultimately came back to be a more important part of the current extremist movement there. In the meantime, you had the 1998 bombings of the U.S. embassies in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi carried out by al-Qaeda, and at least 3 of the activists in those attacks are known to have taken refuge and at least moved in and out of Somalia in the post-1998 period. 2 of them have since been killed. 1 is still hanging around. Moving up to 2006, you had the Union of Islamic Courts attracting more and more support in Somalia. You still have this failed state situation. This attracted the interest of the United States and the Ethiopians, among others, very concerned about the Union of Islamic Courts. They made a very ill-fated decision to provide financing to a group known as the Alliance for Restoration of Peace and Counterterrorism, basically a bunch of warlords who had the support of no one. The effort backfired miserably. The net result was that by the end of 2006, the Union of Islamic Courts had pretty much taken control of most of South and Central Somalia, including much of Mogadishu. That raised the alarm even more. The Ethiopians decided that it was time to send Ethiopian forces in to push the Islamic courts out of power. In a surprise to I think some of us, the Ethiopians managed to do that with greater alacrity than at least I would have thought. They occupied Mogadishu, took power for the first couple of months. It looked like that might be a relatively successful operation. I am very much on the record, however, as opposing that Ethiopian effort from the beginning, because I know the relationship between Somalis and Ethiopians, and it does not have long-term good prospects, and that's precisely what happened when the Ethiopians ultimately left. The UIC fractured soon after it was defeated by the Ethiopians. You had a more radical branch that ultimately transformed itself into al-Shabaab. You had a more moderate group led by Sheikh Sharif, who eventually became President Sheikh Sharif, the president of the Transitional Federal Government of Somalia in the beginning of 2009. So you're getting a development here now where one of the key leaders who was very much feared by the Americans and the Ethiopians in the 2006-2007 period now becomes the president of the Transitional Federal Government, which is the very group that the Ethiopians and the Americans are supporting. In the meantime, the radical element, the al-Shabaab element, is trying to establish closer links to al-Qaeda. It already has members that were trained in Afghanistan. It's an organization that technically developed in a meeting in Las Anod in Somaliland in 2004. The two main leaders at that time were both people who had extensive experience in Afghanistan. One of them is now dead. One of them is the current leader of al-Shabaab, a guy by the name of Godani. As time went on, the leaders of al-Shabaab expressed publicly closer and closer links to al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda reciprocated. There has been a lot of research done on this, documenting on the internet the various statements that have been made by al-Shabaab and al-Qaeda, and at least if you accept what they say publicly as fact, the movement they move closer and closer together. Now, whether in fact the operational control is that significant or not is up for debate. And indeed, the State Department, in any event, concluded in the last annual report on counterterrorism that al-Shabaab is not under the operational control of al-Qaeda. Nevertheless, it has very close links to al-Qaeda. And by the time you get to the last year or two, you have an al-Shabaab organization that, by its appearance and its organization and the way its leadership is functioning, is looking more and more like the Taliban looked back in the 1990s. Al-Shabaab is organized into three layers today. At the very top, you have, as I mentioned, a guy by the name of Godani. Other key leaders include Ibrahim Jama al-Afghani and Fuad Mohammed Khalif Shongole. Now, all three of these people are Somalis. They're not foreigners. On the other hand, you have other layers in the leadership that are very, very critical to the organization. And in these other layers, you find a significant and a growing number of foreigners, either foreigners or Somalis from the diaspora with foreign passports. And if you look, according to one account, at the membership of the 85-member executive council of al-Shabaab today, 42 are Somalis and 43 are foreigners. The International Crisis Group concluded that the hardliners, led by the foreign jihadis, wield enormous influence and have access to resources and the means to dictate their wishes to the less powerful factions in al-Shabaab. Now, there are three kinds of foreigners in al-Shabaab today, by my definition. First, you have Somalis who were born in neighboring Kenya or Ethiopia, but who, to the extent they have a passport at all, would have a passport from Kenya or Ethiopia. But they're in a special category because they're definitely Somalis and they're definitely neighbors. Then the second group would be those Somalis in the diaspora who were either born in the diaspora, or their parents were born in the diaspora, or they may have been born in Somalia and moved somewhere to the diaspora at a fairly early age, and they also have foreign passports, if they have a passport at all. And they are a second category of foreigners or foreign fighters with al-Shabaab. The third category, which is the one that most people probably think of when they think of foreign fighters, are those who are with al-Shabaab who have no Somali ethnic connection and who clearly come from some foreign country. There's a consensus that there are about 200 to 300 of the non-Somali foreign jihadi fighters that are working with al-Shabaab in the country today. And they come primarily from Kenya's Swahili coast, which means they're not Somalis, or from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Afghanistan, Yemen, Sudan, Tanzania, Uganda, Saudi Arabia, among other places, not to mention the North American diaspora and the European diaspora. The Afghan-trained Somalis and the foreign veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq play an important part as al-Shabaab field commanders because of their military experience. And they also are the ones who tend to teach the techniques of suicide attacks, remote-controlled roadside bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations of TSG officials, in addition to journalists, humanitarian workers, and civil society members. The foreign element of al-Shabaab is not only behind the planning of suicide bombings, but it has provided a number of the suicide bombers. For example, in October of 2008, Shirwa Ahmed from Minneapolis became America's first known suicide bomber when he drove a vehicle laden with explosives into an encampment in Puntland that killed a significant number of Somalis. In September of 2009, a Somali American from Seattle was one of two suicide bombers who drove vehicles bearing UN logos into the African Union force and again killed a number of African Union soldiers. And there have been other cases of Somalis from the diaspora serving as suicide bombers. Al-Shabaab has developed one of the most effective media recruitment programs ever developed by a militant Islamist organization. It's been particularly successful with a large number in the Somali diaspora in Europe, North America, the Middle East, Africa, and even Australia. By mid-2009, more than 20 young Somalis, most of them from Minnesota, joined al-Shabaab in Somalia. They constituted, however, a minuscule number of the more than 100,000 Somalis who had moved to the United States. The number may actually be notably larger than that. The arrival of Ethiopian troops in Somalia late in 2006 and a surge of nationalism among these young Somalis, particularly those in the European and North American diasporas, motivated a significant number of these people to go to Somalia as opposed to jihadi rhetoric. As the FBI intensified its efforts to identify Americans recruited by al-Shabaab, it encountered additional cases, not all of whom have a Somali ethnic connection. The diasporas in other countries have also been subject to successful al-Shabaab recruitment. The United Kingdom, the Somali community estimates that there are up to 100 young men and women who have joined al-Shabaab. Some of these folks are actually of Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and West African origin, not Somali origin. The Swedish State Security Police estimate that about 20 Somali Swedes have joined al-Shabaab. And the governments of Australia, Denmark, Canada, Germany, and Norway have also identified small numbers of Somalis, mainly Somalis from their countries, that have gone to join al-Shabaab. What is the upshot of all of this? I think that the employment of Somali fighters by al-Shabaab does bring some very important specialized skills such as bomb making, battlefield experience, and fluency in English to al-Shabaab. So that is a great asset to them. On the other hand, Somalis don't want foreigners involved in their political life. Now, Somalis from the diaspora are not considered foreigners, so they get a pass. But the other guys, the 200 or 300 who are from Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Bangladesh, the Swahili coast of Kenya, etc., are not Somalis, and they, in my view, don't get a pass. And I think this category could eventually be the Achilles heel of al-Shabaab. The bigger question is the degree to which al-Shabaab's draconian tactics, such as suicide bombings, occasional beheadings, forced marriage between Somali women and foreign fighters, will alienate a critical mass of Somalis. I don't have the answer to the question, but I would simply flag that is going to be a problem for al-Shabaab once it becomes better known what they're doing and who they are. Although Somalis increasingly are speaking out against these kinds of policies, which are foreign imports, these are not traditional Somali activities, the situation has not yet reached a point where it appears to endanger al-Shabaab's control over nearly all of southern and central Somalia. And I look forward to my comments from my colleagues on the panel and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Ted?
Well, let me first express my appreciation to you, Mike, and your organization for the invitation. I should also state up front that the views expressed here are my own and do not represent the views of the Congressional Research Service. That buys me a little bit more freedom. But let me also say at the outset that what have we learned from our Somalia experience over the past 2 decades? I think, in my view, very little. Every time there is a crisis, we make assumptions, we make conclusions, and at the same time, we never look back to see if we made a mistake about our assumptions. And I think in this particular case, I mean, I will include myself. I remember after the 1998 bombing, the focus became Somalia. Well, it is a hub of the Al-Qaeda. It is, the safe haven for, the jihadists and so forth. And the first organization that came to mind was Al-Ittihad al-Islami. And at that time, I think the conclusion among people in Washington and elsewhere is that this is a terrorist and jihadist, organization. But when one looks closely, and I think the assumptions also were made that Al-Ittihad had closer links with Al-Qaeda, and Al-Ittihad was put on the terrorism list. But some of us, the minority, actually questioned that. Where is the evidence linking Al-Ittihad with Al-Qaeda? And what has Al-Ittihad done when they were active and operational? It wasn't in the 80s, and it wasn't in the past decade. It was in the 1990s. They operated as small courts and the militia to enforce some of their laws. But did they carry out international terrorist act? They did not. Did they have an international agenda? Not that we know of. If they did, I think the National Islamic Front government in Mogadishu would have been their first ally. But at the same time, I think not only that we have not learned from that experience, but when the Islamic Courts Union took over power in 2006, the assumption in the international community as well as in Washington was that this is a terrorist and a jihadist organization. And again, few of us argue to the contrary. In fact, I did go out in 2007 and met with the leadership in Asmara. And the conclusion that we reached with, while there were some individuals that we should be concerned about, the organization itself, I think, would have been the best hope of containing the extremist elements within the Somalia and also containing the infiltration of outsiders into Somalia. But yet the decision was, no, they are jihadists and Islamists. They got ousted. We focused again on individuals who were not really the mastermind and the terrorist that people thought. It was Iro that everybody focused on. It was the senior commander. He's in charge. No, the real leadership of the Shabab didn't emerge until late 2007. And they weren't largely from central and southern Somalia. They were from peaceful Somaliland. The two top leaders actually come. Godane himself is from Somaliland. But what does that mean? Does it mean that you have a hub in Somaliland? No. It's just we did not have a better understanding of the organizational operation and the individuals behind it. With that, let me go back to provide better context. The 1998 bombing was the first deadly attack in Africa, but it wasn't the only terrorist attack carried out either by local or international organizations. You can go back to the 1970s. Our ambassador and deputy chief of mission were assassinated in Khartoum, Sudan by the Black September group, the Palestinian group. You had in 1995 an assassination attempt against President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt that failed. That was in 1995, before 1998. So you had a number of attacks that were carried out, but not in such a way that people focused on after the 1998 and the September 11 attack. What's interesting is that of all the regions in Africa, it is the Horn of Africa that has emerged over the past 15 years as a region highly vulnerable to terrorist attacks and a safe haven, not just for international organizations, but for local terrorist organizations as well. But the most important thing to focus on is, why Somalia? Well, one can argue it's because you did not have a central authority in place. But is that the only reason that it became a safe haven? If you don't have a government, if you don't have entities, if you don't have infrastructure in place, would international terrorists prefer to operate in an area where they don't have the operational capacity to conduct and organize? No. They use it as safe haven to carry out attacks elsewhere, not necessarily inside Somalia. The terrorist attack that is being carried out against Somalis is basically by Somalis, largely, with the help of some foreigners. What's important to point out also is, as much as I think there is much emphasis on foreign fighters and foreign influence, I would argue that it is totally impossible to make the assumption that Al-Qaeda succeeded over the past decade in influencing, controlling developments either in Somalia or elsewhere. The presence of Al-Qaeda is very much limited to East Africa. They have not succeeded, as there was the case in other parts of the world, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan. But do they have presence? Yes, they do. Are they in control? Well, to some extent, they might be. But when you look at even the Shabab and the other organizations, they're not very much influenced by Al-Qaeda. The exception would be Al-Shabaab. But there are other groups actually fighting the TFG. Are they influenced by them? Such as Hizb al-Islam, or Ahl Sunnah, or even the Islamic Courts Union earlier. The bottom line is, it's not just the TFG fighting Al-Shabaab. It's more than that. It's the regional organization not only based in Somalia. Hizb al-Islam is fighting the TFG, but they've also been fighting Al-Shabaab. Ahl Sunnah is fighting Al-Shabaab. You go into next door Ethiopia. The Ogaden National Liberation Front has been fighting the Ethiopian government, yet they're also at war with Al-Shabaab. In fact, the first major battle that took place in Ethiopia by Al-Shabaab was led by IRO, and that was with the ONLF. And even as recently as last year and this year, a number of the special operations that the ONLF had was inside Somalia against Al-Shabaab. So when you look at the overall picture, yes, they may have been able to recruit some, but at the same time, they've also managed to surround themselves not only with enemies from within, but enemies also in the region. Now, David touched on this and about the emergence of the Islamic courts, I think, which is important. But I think what is relevant to mention here is that we know very little about some of these organizations and the leaderships of this organization. We do know some, but it changes quite a bit. And I think to assume that, so-and-so is the leader today will be the leader tomorrow is, I think, to make the wrong conclusion. We have seen, even with Al-Shabaab, how much dramatic shift that has taken place. It was earlier the IROS, the Muqtarab, but now we're looking at some other leaders. But at the same time, I think it's important to point out that the ability of the Shabaab organization to recruit and retain has been reduced over the past year, in large part because of their own misdoing, because of the attacks they've been carrying out, because of their affiliation, as David mentioned, with foreign entities. As stated before, there were a number of radical Islamic groups in Somalia. Some of this organization did not have influence or control over territory. The groups include Al-Ittihad, Al-Islah, Al-Tabliq, but very few, if any, of these groups developed international terrorist ties. In fact, it's interesting to note that according to the State Department's 2006 counterterrorism report, it says, I quote, "While numerous Islamic groups engaged in a broad range of activities operating inside Somalia, few of these organizations have any known links to terrorist activities. Movements such as Harakat al-Islam, Ahl Sunnah, and others sought power by political rather than violent means and pursued political action via missionary or charity work. And none of this group had foreign fighters in their ranks or were influenced or controlled by a foreign group." Al-Shabaab is perhaps the only organization, in my view, that boasts about its alliances with Al-Qaeda and is considered by many Somalis and the international community as a terrorist organization determined to establish an Islamic State not just in Somalia, but beyond Somalia. But it's important also to point out that Al-Shabaab remains a largely Somali-led and controlled organization whose leaders and fighters are largely Somalis. What contributed to this emergence of Al-Shabaab and its relationship with international terrorist organization? I would argue the Ethiopian invasion, with the support of the United States, is seen by many observers as contributed to the emergence of Al-Shabaab and the proliferation of other extremist groups in Somalia. It is also important to point out that other Somali extremist groups remain opposed to Al-Shabaab, and Al-Shabaab has not been able to gain much ground in terms of recruitments among other militia groups that are opposed to the TFG. I think I would skip the evolution of Al-Shabaab and its leadership. Perhaps I think in the Q&A we can discuss. But as mentioned, some of the foreign fighters within Al-Shabaab are known, but it's difficult to define, as David said, who is actually a foreign fighter. When you look at the TFG, a number of the key ministers and officials are actually individuals who carry American passports or British passports or other passports. If you look at some of them involved in non-governmental activities or humanitarian work, these are also happens to be Somalis on the good side doing work in order to help their people. But unfortunately, the focus has been about those Somalis who go to blow up themselves and target their own civilian population. I don't want to dare estimate the number of foreign fighters, and as David said, I've heard those numbers from 200 to 300 and 400, But the truth of the matter is we don't really know. I, for one, have spent quite a bit of time visiting and meeting people in the region, including a visit to Mogadishu last year. But I cannot claim that I know more than others about, who is a foreign fighter and how many of them are in the rank and file. With that, I think I probably stop here and take your Q&A.
I'd like to begin by thanking Michael and FPRI for the gracious invitation to join you today. I think Ambassador Shin's paper provides a very good introduction to the problems that Somalia is currently confronting, and in particular a very good introduction into the problem of foreign fighters within Somalia. What I want to do in this brief response is to address several question areas that arise from Ambassador Shin's speech and paper, areas that I think are worth considering, worth discussing here, and also that are important for future study. I'm going to present four major question areas, but one thing that should be noted in the study of foreign fighters in Somalia is the dearth of good information that's out there. That's obvious even from the estimates of who's gone to Somalia from various countries. You have country estimates ranging from 20 to 40 in some countries, 40 to 100, and the like, which shows that we're dealing with a partial data set which doesn't allow us to understand the entirety of the problem. A second thing that I'll talk about as I go through is that we have a very West-centric focus to this, and so one of the foreign fighter problems that Ambassador Shin mentioned is one that's least understood analytically and in terms of data, and that's foreign fighters who are from neighboring countries and thus will have less information than those who've come from Western countries. Now, the first question area that I want to talk about is why has Shabab placed so much emphasis on foreign fighters from the West? I don't think we have a very good answer to this question, but Ambassador Shin's paper talks about how Shabab recruiters came to Minnesota and paid for cash for the airfare of recruits to the region. It was also mentioned by Lorenzo Vidino in the earlier panel that this is the one place that stands out as actually having an active recruiting network, as opposed to the model that's been written about by Mark Sageman and others that applies to, say, Pakistan, in which the camps are very much like Ivy League schools. Many people want to enter, many people are turned away. So why is it that Shabab has been devoting so much energy, in contrast to other areas where you have an active jihadist struggle on the ground, in drawing foreign fighters to that conflict? Now, I think there's two possibilities we should consider. One is that this is an organizational decision. That is, Shabab believes that there are important strategic reasons to draw foreign fighters to their conflict. A second thing that we should also consider, especially given the warning that Ted put forward about how we don't have a perfect map of Shabab's leadership or their organizational decision-making structure, is that this isn't really an organizational imperative, but you have one individual, maybe a few individuals, driving this particular recruiting drive, and it's not necessarily related to Shabab's strategy. I think those are the two possibilities. Now, if it is an organizational decision, then the question is, what is the strategic purpose of bringing foreign fighters into Somalia? One possibility is military and strategic gains. Foreign fighters from the West are generally not very valuable on the ground. Professor Menkhaus, who's going to talk after me, noted this in Senate testimony in 2009 when he said that Somalia is already saturated with experienced teenage gunmen. It has no need to import more, and evidence from the ICU in 2006 suggests, in fact, that Somali diaspora, as well as foreign fighters, were as much a liability as an asset to the ICU because they were unfamiliar with the countryside, spoke the Somali language poorly, were likely to become sick, required a fair amount of oversight. In other words, this was unfamiliar terrain. They weren't going to help much militarily. So the key areas where they would be useful, as Ambassador Shin mentioned, are familiarity with computers and the internet, familiarity with English, and the ability to take these young men who've been cut off from their families and turn them into suicide bombers. The question is, does continued recruitment make good organizational sense as opposed to concentrating these resources elsewhere? And I should specify that when I'm talking about foreign fighters in this instance, we're talking about foreign fighters who are from the Somali diaspora or even Westerners, not necessarily those with strong operational links to al-Qaeda, for whom you have a force multiplier effect, which I will talk about in a second. A second possibility, if this is an organizational decision, is that rather than trying to derive a military benefit, this is based upon monetary considerations. That is, drawing more attention to the conflict by recruiting people from the diaspora will help to ensure that there's a stream of money flowing to Shabab in order to finance them. Now, right now, we might say that we're at a point where that strategy is not functioning the way they would like, because as you've seen people become suicide bombers and people indeed getting killed on the battlefield after determining that they didn't at all like it in Somalia, you've started to see a diaspora backlash against Shabab recruiting. That's a significant development, and one which hopefully can be used to stem some of the support that's been going to Shabab. And a third possibility that also needs to be a strong consideration, especially given Shabab's insistence after the Asmara conference in 2007 that it had an international focus, as well as its rhetoric, is that this is designed to expand Shabab's transnational reach. Shabab leaders have, and in particular their Western spokesman, Omar Hamami, also known as Abu Mansour al-Amriki, have talked about how they don't view this conflict as being limited to Somalia's borders, but instead view this as being a global struggle. Hamami talked about in a very famous document he released in January of 2008 how he believes that Shabab, in contrast to the ICU/Alliance for Re-Liberation of Somalia, will not stop until it sees a global caliphate. Now, regardless of whether that goal is unrealistic, what it does indicate is the international focus that you have from some key members within Shabab's leadership. The reason for considering this is because this particular decision to recruit foreign fighters will tell us about Shabab's strategic outlook and Shabab's doctrine, both of which are very inadequately studied, and a better insight into these areas will help us to better understand where we can put points of pressure on Shabab and also staunch the support that goes to the organization. The second point I want to make, which I talked about briefly in my introduction, is the neglected non-Western foreign fighters, that is, those who are already from the Horn of Africa. Now, I was encouraged that Ambassador Shin's paper mentions the three different kinds of foreign fighters. He also mentioned this in his speech. Somalis who were born in Somalia, or whose parents were born in Somalia but carry a foreign passport, foreigners with no Somali ethnic connection, and Somalis born in Kenya and Ethiopia. It's this last kind of foreign fighter that often gets short shrift in the discussion, but I know that particularly within military circles looking at it, there's a concern that neglecting this might be to our own detriment. Now, foreign fighters in Somalia pose twin problems. There's the problem of what they do when they're inside of Somalia, and then there's the problem of what they do when they leave. The current domestic investigation into Shabab recruiting, which is the largest domestic terror investigation since the 9/11 attacks, is very much motivated by the latter concern, the concern of what happens when people return from Somalia, whether they might carry out some sort of terrorist attack or some other kind of jihadi-related activity while they're in the United States. Now, the concern about foreign fighters from Kenya and Ethiopia is that not much is known about them relative to foreign fighters who come from Western countries. Their existence has been noted by several analysts, but we don't know how many there are from these countries. Also, in the case of Somalis who've disappeared in the West, frequently their families will notify authorities that they've gone missing. It's not clear that the same kind of dynamic is at play to the same degree within the diaspora community within Kenya and Ethiopia. So this is a significant problem area. Now, earlier on in the first panel, the distinction was noted between foreign fighters and foreign trained fighters, which is a valid distinction when we're looking at terrorist attacks. But if you're looking at the organization not as a terrorist organization, but instead how certain key leaders within Shabab view it, I think it's much more a military paradigm that we would apply, in that they don't see themselves as a terrorist organization. If you're going by Omar Hamami's view, for example, and you see Shabab as an organization that's going to reinstall the caliphate, you do that by any means that you have. Sometimes it will be unconventional warfare. Sometimes it will be more conventional warfare. But the fact that someone isn't carrying out terrorist attacks in the West doesn't mean that they don't fit within Shabab's strategic outlook. Third thing I want to talk about is the non-Somali contingent as force multipliers. This is something that Ambassador Shin talked about, that they can provide expertise in bomb making, suicide operations, and the like. This same force multiplier comes up frequently in the debate over al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. The argument being that even though al-Qaeda's numbers are relatively small, that they make the people that they fight with much more effective. Now, this is not a made-up idea. There actually is a science to measuring TTPs, that is, tactics, techniques, and procedures. And American analysts spend a lot of time measuring the migration of TTPs. For example, if bomb-making techniques that were perfected in Iraq show up in Somalia, there's a pretty good likelihood that foreign fighters are making an impact on how insurgents fight. Now, to bracket that for a second, there is also another possibility, which is that this expertise is being gleaned from the internet. But I fall on the side of those people who argue that the internet is not making as much of a difference in training as some people say. And I think part of what we can see is that if someone were to propose that our military switch to entirely online training next year to save money, I think it would not be an idea that's accepted. I mean, I think intuitively everyone knows that on-the-ground training is actually much more effective. Now, obviously, Shabab, which is engaged in hot combat on the ground, has its own way to develop combat expertise. So the story of the value of foreign fighters shouldn't actually stop with the force multiplier argument, but I suggest that we can go a little bit deeper into this to understand the ongoing impact of foreign fighters within Somalia. So the questions would include, for example, whether the value of foreign fighters in this regard diminishes over time as Shabab and other insurgent factions gain their own expertise in fighting against factions like the TFG, AMISOM, and the like. One metric we could use would be whether the introduction of new TTPs becomes less over time. Now, that's not a perfect metric because once Shabab adopts the TTPs of foreign fighters could still serve as valuable trainers within those TTPs. But my point is that it's important to measure whether at some point the value of foreign fighters is diminishing in terms of combat on the ground, because that gives us an idea of whether this is a key point of support or whether it's one that tails off over time as they gain their own combat expertise. Now, the fourth and final point I want to talk about, the fourth and final question area, is why Shabab is not an al-Qaeda affiliate. Because it's an interesting question. Ambassador Shin's paper discusses, and I've independently researched and wrote about this, how Shabab holds al-Qaeda in high regard, according to its public messaging, public addresses, and likewise al-Qaeda leaders, who don't always embrace any jihadist group out there, have also issued a number of statements favorable of Shabab. Now, Ambassador Shin's paper mentions that al-Qaeda may have told Shabab to maintain a lower profile about links between the two organizations following the Uganda attacks. I'm not sure whether this is a data point that I haven't been able to investigate. Tracking down the original source, it's anonymously sourced to the Long War Journal, which is edited by a friend of mine, but I have some questions as to the authenticity and the accuracy of this. But I think that there are possibilities as to why this relationship hasn't developed. One is that al-Qaeda's conservatism may be playing a role, their hesitancy to take on new affiliates. If you look at affiliate groups like AKIM and the like, that is Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, it's taken them a long time to actually give the official Al-Qaeda imprimatur. But it's somewhat counterintuitive that this hasn't occurred because of the strategy that bin Laden has clearly articulated in his famous 2004 address that he released just before the election. He described this as the bleed until bankruptcy strategy. That is, you want to get America embroiled in as many draining wars as possible at the same time. He bragged about how just raising an al-Qaeda flag in some far-flung corner of the world will cause America to scamper over there and waste its resources. So it would seem intuitively like it would serve al-Qaeda's strategy to make Shabab an official affiliate. Now, one possibility in addition to their conservatism is perhaps Somalia is actually being seen as a real possible base of strength, and that al-Qaeda, for that reason, doesn't want to attract greater U.S. attention to that theater of war, i.e., it's a backup plan if things go poorly in Afghanistan or if they continue to go poorly in Iraq. Now, al-Qaeda may be making a rebound there, and also if they go poorly in Yemen. There are a number of areas where they operate, but having backup plans, that might not be a bad idea. Now, this is just a possibility. I don't know the answer to the question, but I think it is important to ask the question as to why they're not an official affiliate. In conclusion, I want to say that this is a very important topic, that of foreign fighters in general and in Somalia in particular, one where there are many questions and many more questions than answers overall. Ambassador Shin raises one of the largest questions at the very end of his speech, in which he asks, to what degree will Shabaab's draconian tactics alienate a critical mass of Somalis? And that, too, is a critical question. Overall, sometimes we see things as being weaknesses that don't weaken the organization quite as much. One example of that is debates over the Islamic court's implementation of Sharia law back in 2005, 2006, which was far more brutal than what Somalia was used to. But overall, the fact that it was able to impose order in many cases made the Islamic courts at least seem preferable to anarchy, which was one of those other possible alternatives. So there are possibilities out there in terms of structural factors which can weaken Shabaab, but also it's important not to overstate what's going to happen with those possibilities. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My colleagues have taken many of the points that I was going to make, and that's fine. So I'll deal you the ones that are still left. And the first thing I'd like to do is to put the whole question of foreign fighters in Somalia, foreign fighters for that matter in Africa in broader context, and that is an African context of political weakness. Africa is the theater for other people to play out their wars, their culture wars, their fantasies, their struggles. It's very important that we keep in mind the fact that what's happening in places like Somalia and elsewhere is very much a function of a political vacuum. We've got lots of non-state actors, not just foreign fighters in Somalia, but Salafist mosques springing up all over the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. Western Christian groups, for that matter, engaged in extraordinarily robust church-to-church outreach across Africa. We've got a level of non-state actor engagement across Africa, pursuing their own agendas, again, advancing their own ideologies, sometimes playing out their own fantasies. And using whatever means necessary. A lot of times it just involves money. The real struggle in Somalia right now is actually a struggle between the Salafists and the Sufis over the proper form of Islam, with the vast majority of Salafist energies not being devoted to jihad, but rather to purifying what they see as the corrupted form of Islam, Sufi Islam in Somalia. And I think that's helpful to keep in mind that this is the broader context within which these several hundred foreign fighters in Somalia need to be seen. The question of why has the Somali diaspora supported, and in some cases not just financially or morally, but actually physically gone over to join Shabaab? My colleagues have already alluded to the answer that it has to do in large part with the Ethiopian military occupation in 2007, 2008. I just want to reinforce that because what they didn't do is really capture the sense of rage among Somalis. When the Ethiopians intervened in Somalia in December of 2006, that set in motion an insurgency and a counterinsurgency that devastated the capital. 700,000 people out of a population of 1.3 million had to flee the city. It was one of the largest and worst cases of internal displacement in the world. A lot of valuable real estate was shattered. The old ICU governance, which many Somalis saw as the hope, as an exit to 16 years of civil war, was destroyed. And Somalis were furious. They were furious at Ethiopia. They were furious at us for backing Ethiopia. That was a more complicated story, actually, than they choose to believe in some cases. But what this meant is that when Shabaab emerged as the main insurgency against the Ethiopian occupation, they had a lot of support from Somalis. Somalis around the world did not see Shabab as a jihadist group. They didn't necessarily like it. What they knew about it, they found distasteful. But Shabab was able to conflate this sense of defensive jihad, anti-Ethiopianism, and Islamism with Somali nationalism. That really resonated among a lot of people. And so many Somalis in the diaspora rejected the premise of our designation of Shabab as a terrorist organization in March 2008. Why so many non-Somalis supporting Shabab rhetorically, or in a few hundred cases actually going over and supporting them? Well, here I think what we have to acknowledge is that Somalia in 2007-2008 was a perfect fit for the al-Qaeda meta-narrative. Here was a Christian-dominated government of Ethiopia coming in and crushing and oppressing Muslims with the backing of the evil empire of the United States. I mean, you can see exactly how this fit in. There were. I think it was relatively easy for some to be convinced that this was the next great front in their struggle. But there's another way of asking this question, and that is, why so few? There are 1 million to 1.5 million Somalis in the diaspora. It's we were just debating this at lunch. Between 14 and 15% of the total Somali population, we have no idea what percentage it is, but roughly 15% of the total Somali population now lives abroad. It's a huge number of people. And yet, the number who've come back to fight have been relatively small, given the level of rage and anger, and I mean radical anger. I used to provoke taxi drivers here in Washington during that period, Somali taxi drivers. I'd ask them, "Oh, you're Somali?" I'd say, "Yeah," and just to see their reaction, I'd say, "Wow, it's a great thing about Ethiopia coming in, really straightening up your house for you." And there would be spit on the windshield. I'd be afraid that there'd be an accident, but they didn't act on it. A very small number in the end acted on it. Many contributed money in 2007, 2008, but in terms of people actually going over and becoming, foreign fighters, a relatively small number. And I asked myself why. And I think there's one clue that we haven't talked about yet today that's really important. The Somali economy, one of the poorest economies on earth, really right on the edge, 3.5 million people in need of emergency assistance, one step away from what the UN is worried could become a famine, is totally dependent on remittances from this diaspora. The remittances total, again, ballpark figures, between $1 billion to $1.5 billion a year. There is no other source of hard currency that comes even close to matching that in Somalia. 100 million a year from livestock, 80 million a year from piracy, give or take a few million. I mean, there's really not a lot else out there. The diaspora, in short, is the lifeline of the Somali people, and that has been a constraint. Somalis in the diaspora have a very powerful obligation to remit and a very powerful obligation to protect this entire system of remittances. If they start engaging in terrorist attacks in the United States, elsewhere, if they run the risk of a law enforcement clampdown, which has already happened, which is jeopardizing the remittance system itself. I think to the extent that the Somali diaspora has to care about the impact of its actions on its people back home, to the extent that Shabab has to care about the impact of its actions on this remittance economy, that serves as a constraint to what could otherwise be, I think, quite easy, low-hanging fruit for them to engage in terrorist attacks in Kenya, at least, and certainly possibly beyond. This gets us to the question of which diaspora we're talking about among the foreign fighters and other supporters of Shabab. And the generational dimension that's been alluded to, I think, is really important to reinforce as well. The wave of actual immigrants, the older generation of Somalis, has an extremely strong interest in this remittance economy and in the impact of its actions on family members back home. The first generation, the younger kids who are either born here or who've essentially been raised here, are very different in this regard. They are exhibiting much less interest in remitting money back to Somalia. They do not share the same sense of commitment to family, and this is key, to the extended family. But some of them are really attracted to Somalia as a concept and as an identity. And it's that generation that has been recruited in small numbers, but significant numbers for our purposes, into to Shabab, they're more dangerous potentially because they might be convinced that what's important is in fact a much bigger prize than the impact of their actions on Somalia. As for the foreigners, the non-Somalis and the foreign fighters, I think we've tended to get hung up on the numbers, and the numbers I think are much less important than the roles that they're playing. Again, as David already mentioned, I've argued that Somalia needs a lot of things, but it doesn't need to import teenagers adept with AK-47s. They're flush with that. So as fighters, I'm not convinced that this is the most important role that they have to play. And we have heard, in fact, from people in the old ICU that the foreigners really did need to be babysat. They were more trouble than they were worth out in the field. We've got very limited evidence that foreign units have been decisive in battles in Somalia. There was one town, Johar, that apparently was taken by a foreign unit, but otherwise that's not their principal role. But they do play very important roles as advisors. Remember that Shabab was just a militia. That was under the political control of the ICU until 2007, when it assumed the role of movement. It said, now we're the political leadership. Well, they were all muscle and no brain. They needed advice, and I think some of those outsiders provided them with some very important advice and continue to do so, and I think Ambassador Shin is correct in being cautious about whether or not we can conclude that they were in charge or simply advised. I tend to believe it would be implausible that Somalis would accept people coming into their own country and taking direct control over a movement. It's possible, but I think it's very unlikely. They also, I think, are an important source of threat for Shabab-linked terrorist attacks in the region for the reason that they don't necessarily have as much at stake in terms of the impact on Somalia. And I think it's significant that most of the individuals linked to the bombings in Kampala were not Somali on that score. We've heard that the foreign fighters, both non-Somali and Somali, have suffered from low morale in the past couple of years, and I think that stands to reason. There are a couple of reasons for it. One is the Ethiopians withdrew. And so the principal raison d'etre for joining, for many, was Ethiopia's occupation, and then it was gone. So now they're having to fight against a government that is led by their former boss, a moderate Islamist from the old ICU. The other reason, though, is that this is a conflict now that since the Ethiopians withdrew, for almost 2 years, it's been in complete stalemate. Shabab has not made many advances. Why not? If they've got thousands of people and all this support, why haven't they been able to push the African Union troops out? Why haven't they been able to take Puntland? Why haven't they been able to do more? And more importantly, why haven't they governed? They are not Hezbollah. They are not establishing a shadow state. They're not trying to win performance legitimacy among their population. They're essentially outsourcing governance to existing local authorities, saying, you consult with us, but you go about your business. Exceptions in the major urban areas. That's where they have imposed their rule, and it's been quite ugly and very unpopular with the Somalis. Shabab also hasn't declared a state. It controls most of Mogadishu and most of south-central Somalia, and that's an interesting puzzle. Why not? Well, the fact that there's been no progress for 2 years suggests to some in the movement that, well, first of all, it's not fun to be mobilized in perpetuity in the very difficult environment of Somalia. Make no mistake, it's not a fun place to live right now. It's very hard living, and I think absent an active cause, morale could be low. But I think there are some who might be suspecting that Shabab actually prefers a stalemate right now. Shabab, in its current position, gets to mobilize against an enemy, both near and far, so that it continue to win some outside support, but it doesn't have to actually govern. If it were to take the rest of Mogadishu, it would be it would unavoidably have to start governing. And it might even, it would be forced to address this issue of, in fact, are we for an Islamic caliphate, or are we really fighting for an Islamic Somali state? The vast majority of Somalis want a Somali state. This notion of a caliphate means nothing to them. This is a foreign dream world for them, and the last thing that they want to get engaged in. In some, Shabab would have its hand forced if it had to govern. All the messy decisions about who rules and how do we handle clan. Do we allocate proportionally, or do we just allocate according to merit? And if we do merit and one clan gets more positions than the other, then this clan's going to argue. There's 1,000 governance issues that they have very successfully avoided by continuing to be in a war that has amounted to a prolonged stalemate, but that has come at a cost of low morale. What about Al-Qaeda, the group behind at least some of the foreign fighters, not the freelancers, but the organized ones? My own take is that Al-Qaeda is dabbling in Somalia. This is low cost, low risk, high yield irritant to the United States and its friends in the region. They have to do very little, and they cause us enormous headache. They have not been providing much, if any, financial support to Shabab. As Professor Sageman said, they don't have the money, and we've got no evidence that that's flowing in. Shabab's main sources of revenue are local taxation, very crude forms of taxation, and control of the seaport of Kismayo, so that Al-Qaeda comes a distant fourth or fifth in terms of their financing. And as a result, this is an easy win for Al-Qaeda. They got to appropriate Shabab's victory over Ethiopia, pushing Ethiopia out without having to do very much at all. Shabab and the media, just wanted to say a word about that. Ambassador Shin was very generous to them in saying that he thought it was one of the most effective media campaigns. I just don't see it. This is one of the only things I can find to disagree with you on this. I think that many of the YouTube videos that they've put out, the propaganda, has been... Well, let me put it this way. Somalis are incredibly politically savvy consumers of information and arguments, and foreign... whether it's our PSYOPs or UN public affairs or Al-Qaeda, Assahab Media Foundation messaging, if it comes across as manipulative or clunky in any way, it doesn't sell among Somalis. And most of the stuff I've seen has been incredibly clunky on that score. I just don't think they've done that good a job. Having said that, there has been a lot of support for Shabab, and I think what we have to acknowledge is it's not necessarily because of their media campaign. It might be in spite of it, but it's because they couldn't lose. The playing field is so much in their favor at this point. There's no one opposing Shabab of any legitimacy right now in the transitional federal government. They basically had a storyline that they couldn't sufficiently botch up. And this gets me to just a couple of final thoughts. One is the big question, I think, which is why is Shabab so powerful in Somalia? And the related question then is, what role do the foreign fighters have in that power? And their power right now is essentially a reflection of the utter weakness of alternatives. They are the strongest team on the playing field right now because they're the only team on the playing field right now. The transitional federal government, after 6 years of transition, it was supposed to be a 5-year transitional mandate, is still unable to govern itself out of a paper bag. It's only in the small neighborhoods of Mogadishu that it controls, thanks to the African Union peacekeepers supporting them. And as a result, Somalis, for as distasteful as they find Shabab, aren't going to risk rebelling against them if there are no prospects for alternatives. I think one of the things that Shabab does very effectively is intimidate and threaten and assassinate, and people as a result are going to be very risk averse in going after them. They're going to need to see that there's a credible alternative that stands a good chance of winning before they turn directly against Shabab. With that, I will stop, and I guess we do Q&A or discussion, right?
Yeah, we'll put discussion first. Mr. Ambassador, do you care to respond here?
Actually, I'd prefer to use what time we have left to hear questions from the floor and just take it from there.
Okay. Again, if you just queue up at the microphone, introduce yourself, say any affiliation you might have, and remember, no speeches, just questions.
I'll try my best. My name is Abdul Ahmed from Arizona State University. I'm familiar with some of you. Dr. Menhouse said that, talked about Somalia as a monolithic, in fact, all of you talked about Somalia as one monolithic state. And you talk of Somali people, which really surprised me a lot. So if we talk about Somali people live in Djibouti, they live in Kenya, they live in Ethiopia, and what used to be Somali Democratic Republic, I call it the former Somalia. But in reality, what's going on, in my opinion, and I want to ask you, is Somalia is a clan society, very clannish society. Al-Shabaab has won in some areas and did not win in some areas. They only won in the areas where they dominated clan-wise. You talk about statistics, Somalia, you say 42, 43%. If you break it by clan, you would know. Follow the clan. Just like they say in the U.S., follow the money. I want you to touch on that. And comparing Africa, African countries, again, as a monolithic country in Somalia. Somalia has got a lot with Fatah, between Bajur and with South Wazir. Then it has in common with Uganda, to be honest with you. A pure clan society. Al-Shabaab and terrorists have been defeated in Puntland in 1992. None of you have mentioned that. Why?
Shabaab didn't exist then.
Al-Ittihad has been defeated in Puntland. That's the truth. Follow the money in the USA, follow the clan in Somalia. If you want to help Somalis, be strong for Somalis. Do not just, it's almost irresponsible to say Al-Shabaab is nationalistic. There's no nationalistic search. In fact, the absence of nationalism is what we have in Somalia. And so support those, and please base your arguments on data. There's plenty of data out there. But to sit down and have this temptation to solve all the problems by putting inputs there that are not examined is almost like a revelation. And thank you.
Who would care to respond first?
Yeah, I'll take a first crack at that. First of all, I would stand by my argument that Shabaab was able to successfully conflate Islamism and nationalism in the past few years as a negative nationalism, as opposition to an Ethiopian intervention, and I think that the evidence is pretty strong on that score. As for clan and Somali society, clan and Shabaab, as was the case with the Islamic Courts Union, has tried very hard to transcend clan. We saw that back in the early 90s with Al-Ittihad as well. I had a chance to look and interview people in Luke shortly after they left and get a sense of the clan dynamics there. One of the and it's bedeviled the Islamic movements, just as it's bedeviled nationalists in Somalia. There are Somalis in Shabaab who really do want to transcend clan, don't want to talk about it. And certainly don't want to base their political organization around it. But having said that, they have to pay close attention to it. And you're right that there have been clans that have over time served as the anchor for Shabaab, and before that the ICU. What's interesting about that, and this is one of the dangers for the foreign fighters and for al-Qaeda, is that your protection as a foreigner in Somalia is largely based on clan protection, and that goes back a long, long way. Clans kind of look after you, you've got to be really careful. If a clan turns on you, you are very prone to being extorted or worse. And in Somalia, we have had clans that at one time were very closely affiliated with the ICU and then Shabaab. I think of the Habrgadir Air, for instance, who at a certain point in time realized that, or calculated that this was no longer in their interest. This was costing them a lot. There were a lot of business people whose interests were jeopardized, and they shifted as an entire sub-clan away from Shabaab and then came to be one of the principal supporters of al-Sunnah wal-Jamaa. Well, if I'm Shabaab, I'm paying attention to this, because now Shabaab is relying on weaker clans, clans that are aggrieved, minority clans. I mean, they've been quite careful to try to undercut some of these stronger clans by recruiting from among these somewhat either weaker or aggrieved clans. And What if they get picked off? What if that clan then decides that this is no longer in our interest to be affiliated with this group? I think it's a potential entry point for the United States in its policies in Somalia, and it's certainly a weakness in terms of the relationship between Al-Qaeda and Shabaab.
Well, I think everyone up here at the table fully understands the importance of clan in Somalia, and I don't think that anyone suggested that clans were not important. In terms of referring to Somalis as a monolithic society, I must confess I didn't use that term. I'm not aware that anyone else did, and I don't think any of us up here thinks that Somalis are a monolithic society. You made the point about Al-Shabaab and nationalism. I certainly made the point, and maybe Ken did too, that Al-Shabaab has taken advantage of the fact that they played on Somali nationalism by pointing to the Ethiopian invasion of Somalia, and that tended to identify and bring out Somalis who supported Al-Shabaab for that reason. But I certainly would not suggest that Al-Shabaab is a Somali nationalistic organization. Quite the contrary. In summarizing my paper, I left out the vast majority of it, but in the paper I include a section, for example, that says Al-Shabaab avoids nationalist slogans, Somali nationalist slogans, and refuses to use the traditional Somali flag, which it replaced with a black flag emblazoned with a Shahada, a declaration of faith, in white text, and that it often holds press conferences in Arabic, not in Somali, the traditional language of Somalis. So quite the contrary, it's not a Somali nationalist organization at all. Now, the one thing that I think Al-Shabaab has done with some success that most other political and pseudo-political organizations have largely failed to do, at least in recent years in Somalia, is that it has crossed clan lines to some extent. It has been able to attract some leadership coming from various parts of Somalia, including Somaliland. And that, I think, it has done with more success than any other recent Somali organization in the country.
I think I would make the argument that I think for the first time in the past, several years, we have seen Somalia move beyond the clan politics. You look at the leadership of Al-Shabaab or the leadership of the ICU, it's more inclusive than any time. You look at where the dominance of Al-Shabaab, it's not where they come from. You're looking at it in the Darod area and the Kismayo, not the Isaac area. So I think it's important to point out that while clanism is still very important, at the same time, face the reality. The leadership has changed. Religion is more important for Shabaab, whether you are a Hawi or a Darod.
Is that based on data? Or just
Yes, based on data.
Can you share the data?
Yep. I'll be happy to share a number of reports that we did, and we highlight the leadership, where they come from.
I have shared data with Noonan, and the fact is 87% of Al-Shabaab are southern clans, particularly southern clans from Mogadishu area.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have data, I'll be very interested to see that.
And you conducted the survey in the midst of the violence, right?
Well, but you have done in the past, and I don't want to go personal, but there were so many questions that you have admitted in your speak in your past papers that proved to be wrong. So I would like to see your data.
Sure.
Sam?
I just, Sam Halfont, I'm an adjunct scholar at FPRI. I have a question about something that Ken brought up about the idea of a stalemate and Al-Shabaab actually preferring a stalemate. And it reminded me of a certain discourse that's taking place within the Muslim Brotherhoods throughout the Middle East, particularly the Arab Middle East, after the Hamas success, which has been looked at by many as a complete failure, trying to take political control. And there's been an almost strategic choice to not be in power. And instead of looking at political goals, looking at social goals, that the point would be to take a longer-term vision and transform society before. And I mean, here on a security standpoint, we tend to look away from social motivations, and we're looking for what do they want politically, what are they trying to do, and I'm wondering if there could be a parallel between sort of these discourses that are taking place within Muslim Brotherhood organizations about not taking power and sort of keeping a stalemate going where you're increasing strength and transforming society, where if the point is to transform society, or is the point to take political power. Here we're dealing mostly with the idea of taking political power, but it seems like we might be missing something of, as an Islamist organization, their ultimate goal isn't necessarily political power, but transformation of society. And I was wondering if you could maybe discuss that, or if there is a parallel at all from completely off.
No. Since I'm the person who made the comment, I'll start.
Sure to use the mic.
Let me begin by saying that the idea that the prolonged stalemate in Somalia is if not a desirable outcome, a minimally satisfying outcome for all parties concerned, and not just Shabab, but in many ways the transitional federal government leadership has succeeded in making lots and lots of money off of pretending to govern for 6 years without having to go through any of the arduous task of actually governing. One could reach that conclusion. I haven't reached it myself, but I think it's important to put out on the table as a possible explanation that this isn't optimal for anyone, the current situation, but it's minimally acceptable for lots, including neighboring Ethiopia. Not optimal, but they can live with it, and that that's a worrisome conclusion, because that means this could go on and on. In the case of Shabab, we don't know. They don't have a discourse that I'm privy to on this. But what we do know is that they're split over the ones that think there should be a Somali Islamic State versus the ones who embrace the notion of Somalia simply as a staging point for a broader caliphate. And then those who would love to have a Somali state, but they're deathly afraid of having to make all those political decisions, and they know, and I think we all know, that were they to do this, the next war would be an intra-Islamist war. The center would not hold within Shabab. There would be fighting among the Islamists over all of the issues that have bedeviled Somalis trying to pull together a state over the past 20 years. And that's about as far as I can go on the answer.
Let me add to that. I find Ken's point interesting.
Hold the microphone closer.
Let me add to that. I find Ken's point interesting that al-Shabaab may be satisfied with a stalemate, a military and political stalemate. I'm not convinced that's what they want, but it's certainly something that one needs to consider. And if you look at just what has happened in the last several weeks with al-Shabaab trying to take over additional territory in Mogadishu that they have never held before, that would imply that they are not satisfied with a stalemate, that they really do want to take over much more or perhaps all of Mogadishu. I don't think they can do that so long as the African Union force is there. But that's the only sort of shred of evidence I can cite to counter your argument. I think your question is a very interesting one, which really goes beyond that. Does al-Shabaab want to take political power or transform society? That's a very big and important question. And I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I suspect what's going on is that you have a division within al-Shabaab. I think you have particularly the Somali element of al-Shabaab and the Somali nationalist element of al-Shabaab, to the extent it exists, that really is probably satisfied with having political control of Somalia, and that's the end of the matter. And all of this global jihad and Islamic caliphate and all that other stuff, that's for the foreigners, and that's for a few of wild-eyed radicals who were educated with the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia and perhaps some of the Muslim brothers in Egypt. And my guess is you've got some divisions going on within al-Shabaab on that sort of very question, even though they may not broach it quite that way. But I think that's a very important question and one that we all ought to pay more attention to.
I agree that it's a great question, and I think part of I tend to fall on Ken's side on this, in that increasingly I think that Shabab does not want at this point in time to gain political power in Somalia. And the reason why is game out what happens if they defeat the TFG. I mean, one thing you can have is an inter-Islamist war. You'll probably get another intervention by Ethiopia or someone else that will fracture, at least temporarily, Shabab. Now, they could see that as being a good thing, but I'm not sure that they're ready for it to happen. There's some evidence suggesting that when the Islamic courts had massed around Baidoa, this was back in November, December 2006, which looked like death count for the TFG prior to the Ethiopian invasion. Some of the evidence suggests that they actually were not going to invade Baidoa to destroy the TFG. Now, I haven't gotten a look at all of this, so I can't really weigh in. But I think, finally, to address your question, because I think it's first good to understand the framework in which their decision is made against a backdrop of if they kill the TFG, if they win, then suddenly they need to be prepared for something else, because the international community is not just going to say, okay, we recognize you. But I think some of that transformation, we could see that transformation to some degree. I mean, as was talked about with respect to the history of Somalia. You first started to have Islamist movements there that were influenced by Wahhabis and the like, and by the Brotherhood. And so some of that methodology was certainly imported. Now, that's never been the majority view in terms of the way Islam is understood within Somalia. But I think some of the things that, for example, Ken referred to, the dynamic on the ground of conflicts between Salafists and Sufis and the attempts to purify the religion, that's very much in line with what you're talking about, which is setting the stage for people to be much more on board with a different practice of Islam. And the final thing I want to point out is just when we talk about Somalia's territorial borders and nationalist aspects, it's not actually Somalia that we're talking about. I mean, I don't know of any faction within Shabab that has abandoned the view of the greater Somalia, which encompasses not just Somalia's territorial borders, but also those places close to Somalia, such as the Ogaden region of Ethiopia, that are comprised of a majority of Somali-speaking individuals. So it's important that when we say nationalism, that it doesn't quite map with the way we understand nationalism from a Western perspective.
Ted, did you have any comments? No. Okay. Alan, do we have any questions from the web?
Nope.
No? Okay. Sorry.
I'm Dylan Craig from American University, and I have a question primarily for Professor Menkhaus, but I think that I've seen things in each of the addresses which the panelists might find interesting to sort of speculate on, so I'd welcome any responses they have. This idea that Somalia is used as a sort of political vacuum in which a variety of actors play out their, in some cases, political or ideological fantasies. We've heard a very nice breakdown from the panel about the particular ways that, for instance, Al-Shabaab is playing out its fantasies or self-narrations. And there have been some tantalizing hints about sort of regional interests. We've heard, for instance, discussions of does this suit Ethiopia's long-term agenda? But I was wondering if anyone had, if there were other important political actors in the presence of foreign fighters in Somalia that you would like to speculate on. To which other political actors does the foreign nature of Shabab's makeup at the various levels serve as a positive or a negative aspect of the conflict?
I thought you were going to take that in a different direction, and then you asked about the composition of Shabab. What I'm going to do is summarize in some ways what Ambassador Shin's paper has already said, and that is that the vast majority of the so-called foreigners that we're referring to are in fact Somalis of various types, either from the region or from the broader diaspora, and that is a source of, I mean, that does nothing to erode the legitimacy of Shabab in the eyes of Somalis in general. I would say one thing, though. I mean, again, this is not an idea that I'm wedded to. It's a bit like the stalemate scenario, but it's something that needs to be out on the table, and that is that tensions between the diaspora and the Somalis, the Reer Somali, might be greater than we sometimes give credence to. I have heard Somalis from Somalia, non-passport-holding Somalis, I don't know what other term we can use for them, complain that the past 5 years has been a war of the diaspora. The diaspora control the TFG. They're the main source of parliamentarians and cabinet members and prime ministers, and that the diaspora is largely behind Shabab. They're fighting out their war, and we're stuck in the middle. And if that's true, that even the diaspora's involvement then has some political consequences. As for the non-Somalis, I don't have enough confidence in the national breakdown of them to say. I think it's certainly true that the majority are from the Swahili coast, from the region. What that means in Somalia, generally speaking, I think the comments that you've heard today that non-Somalis in Somalia don't do anything good for a movement and can help discredit it. I think one of Shabab's real weaknesses right now is the charge that more and more Somalis are leveling at it, that it's a puppet of foreign interests that are the Al-Qaeda seeking its own interests at the expense of the Somali people. But do you have thoughts about the specific breakdowns?
Well, in terms of numbers, I do not, but I would point out two elements of the foreign element of the foreign group that is working with Al-Shabaab that I think merit closer attention than any of the other elements. Ken just mentioned one of them, and that's the Kenyans from the Swahili coast. And my impression is that they are quite numerous in the organization. They may constitute the single largest foreign element in Al-Shabaab. I have no way of proving that, and no one has been willing to even give me an estimated number. They just say that this is a very large component of the foreign element of Al-Shabaab. This is a group that we really ought to know a lot more about than we do. For one thing, you do have people, Somalis from the southern part of Somalia, who speak pretty good Swahili, and I don't think that any of these Swahili coast people from Kenya and Tanzania speak Somali. There may be the odd one who does, but it would be quite rare. But there nevertheless there's a connection here that's a little closer than with a Pakistani or a Bangladeshi or someone else. And what does all this mean? Well, I'm not sure what it means, but I'm concerned about it, and I wish we knew a lot more about this link than we know, and I just think we know very little. The other one is the group, and I don't know what numbers are, but according to press reporting, they're increasing, is the group from Yemen, because there is a special linkage between Somalia and Yemen, at least a closer link than there is with, say, Pakistan or Sudan or some of the other locations around the world where some of the foreign fighters have come from. And that, too, I don't know enough about to know what all does it mean, but I think there's something significant there that we ought to know more about.
I think, I want to caution us a little bit here. There is no evidence to suggest that Somalis from neighboring countries have joined either in large numbers or in any number at all. When you look at the fact that Somalis, for example, in Ethiopia, bordering Somalia, they tend to be largely the Ogadenis, very much influenced by some of the activities by some of the organized groups. And the Ethiopian security would have made it also impossible for those who would want to volunteer and cross the border into Somalia. The same argument can be made about the Somalis in Djibouti. One has to look at also the clan makeup in Djibouti, as well as, I think, the political orientation among Djiboutians. And yes, in Kenya you do have Muslims who volunteer to join, but I wouldn't stick my head out and say these are Kenyan Somalis. There are Muslims who volunteered. At the same time, you have also Kenyan Muslims who actually joined for training purposes to fight against Al-Shabaab, which later on they were removed from a group that were being trained by the Kenyan forces. So I think, it's important to be cautious. We don't know enough. I would say there are individuals who have joined, but I don't think one can make the argument that you had large number of Ethiopians or Djiboutians or Kenyans who have joined the Shabab.
I would just add one point. I agree with Ted in terms of the remarks about Somalis in Djibouti and Somalis in Ethiopia. What I have been hearing and what I did hear on my recent visit to Kenya is that there were reasonably important groups of Somali Kenyans who were joining with al-Shabaab. Probably not as many as there were from the Swahili coast, who are non-Somalis. But those two groups were fairly significant.
Okay. What? We have.
a quick question.
I think we have a couple of people lined up first. There's. Okay. I know you had raised your hand. Is it a quick question?
Very quick question, actually.
And then
that's about the hypothesis that al-Shabaab wants stalemate. If Shabaab is so rational that they don't want to turn the wall against them, why would they go and attack Kampala? Wouldn't that turn the wall against them even more?
The attack in Kampala was very important because up to that point, the hypothesis that, not the stalemate hypothesis, but the hypothesis that Shabab had to avoid doing anything that could jeopardize the status of the Somali diaspora in order not to jeopardize the flow of remittances seemed to be a pretty plausible explanation. I was comfortable with it, that there was a constraint. And then they went in July and attacked Kampala, and it raises a question I don't have answers for. One is, does this mean that Shabab, as a unified movement, made a decision that it doesn't need to, it's going to take the war beyond Somalia regardless of the cost to Somalis? Or B, was this actually an instance of different divisions within Shabab taking different actions? And they have been split over tactics. They were very split after the December 09 suicide bombing at the medical graduation ceremony. The fact that most of the people involved in the Kampala bombings were not Somalis leads me to be open to the possibility that was an example of the foreigners doing their own thing, and some of the Somali Shabab being opposed to it. But we don't know. Time will tell on that one. But it's a very important issue to follow up on.
What I'd say is, to me, it seems like it was an organizational decision to carry out the attack within Uganda, and that's based upon statements made both before and after the Kampala attacks, basically flagging that they saw Uganda as being a primary target, and warnings that they'd carry out additional attacks. I think that, for me, the thesis that they prefer a stalemate is not really based on them being a wholly rational actor, but that a stalemate is best for them. And now, let me say, a stalemate doesn't necessarily mean a stalemate with the TFG in place in Mogadishu. Last time, of course, when the TFG was being pushed out by the Islamic courts, it went to Baidoa. But I think that having an enemy in the country continues to give them a rallying point, saying, look, it's foreign occupation, and to hit the nationalist messages that have been helpful to them. And obviously, I'm not saying they're a wholly nationalist group. We're all on the same page about that. But I think having an enemy in the country is good for Shabab. And look, you can control a lot of territory while still having somewhat of a stalemate. Because, look, right now you have the TFG controlling a very small part of Mogadishu. If they move to Baidoa, they still control a sliver of the country. It doesn't hurt their ability to govern or to do the kind of things that they would want to do on the ground, but what it saves them from is having the whole country in their hands. They can still blame somebody else, and they can still rally people to their cause by the fact that the country is still being occupied by foreigners.
Peter?
Peter Pham. I just wanted to, I'm fascinated, Ken, by your point on the stalemate being perhaps, if not the most desirable, certainly an acceptable outcome for Shabab. I'd like to turn that around and ask, since we've got a deadline coming up, depending on how you read the Transitional Federal Charter, it expires in 5 months or a little less than a year, depending on how one parses that document. And we all know that the transitional federal government exists because we outsiders want it to exist and keep it primed and pumped. So is it in our interest to maintain the stalemate, or do we pull the rug out in 5 months or 11 months, depending on how we read the documents?
Well, Peter, let me turn the table around. You pulled the rug out, then what?
Well, I had a provocative piece I wrote earlier in the year where I suggested that we call Shabab's bluff, let them have the South Central, and let them fall on each other as an option, at least that would move it beyond the stalemate. I put it out provocatively to raise a debate, but that's certainly one option. There are a range of others. So I'm throwing that out as what do we do in 5 months or 11 months with the TFG? Do we come up with another excuse to punt it down the road and therefore go from passively accepting the stalemate to pushing it along? Or that's a question. I really don't have the full answer, but I'd like to hear the panel's response.
I think it's fascinating to hear that the TFG is ineffective. The TFG only control a few blocks in Mogadishu. What does the Shabab control? It's not control that we're talking about. It's terror that we're talking about without control. Governance is something else. I think it's also important to point out that the international community has invested hugely, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we have hundreds of thousands of troops and billions of dollars invested. Have we succeeded there in containing, eliminating the threat of Al-Qaeda or Taliban? We've not. But look at what happened with the TFG. How long have they been in power? Who actually weakened the Islamic Courts Union to begin with? And how much time were they given, and how much support were they given in order to contain the threat that is coming, not just from Al-Shabaab, but from their allies? I think, we have to be practical. We're not talking about, a government that had been there in power, but I think a government that needs support, practical support, not political support and Security Council resolution.
Peter, I think what will happen, based on my many years of policy experience, as opposed to what perhaps ideally should happen, is that the international community will continue to support the TFG, whatever it happens to be at the time its mandate runs out. And I agree there's a little confusion about when that mandate ends. Because there is so much invested in it, and there still is no alternative. Al-Shabaab is clearly not an alternative. And I know that there are those around Washington and elsewhere who would just like to sort of see, let Al-Shabaab take over and let them fall on their own sword kind of thing. But I just don't see that argument prevailing in Washington.
I also would have two specific concerns, one of which is U.S. reputation. That one of the big problems with Somalia is the fact that the U.S. seemed to countenance a situation of anarchy for so long. Obviously, the TFG is, in my view, more symbolic than anything else, but I wonder if it furthers the U.S. reputation as being willing to sell allies up the river. The second one, which is more practical and less based in reputation, is what would happen to ASWJ, which I see as being a fairly important actor and one that may be more important over time. And I think that if one of the results would be Ahl Sunnah ends up getting pushed out of the country or destroyed, then that could be problematic.
You all don't follow Somalia, most of you, for a living, so you probably didn't see this. But just a couple of days ago, we did have a statement from Assistant Secretary of State Johnny Carson of some significance on this score, in which he outlined a more assertive U.S. engagement with other actors, not delegitimizing or disenfranchising the TFG. We're going to continue to work to strengthen it, but we're going to diversify our points of contact with Somaliland, Puntland, and other legitimate actors. I don't remember the exact wording. To me, that is an entry point toward a strategy to address exactly the issue that you're raising. That the TFG is up. Its extended mandate is up in August with a generous interpretation. It's up in August. And what do we do in the meantime? I think that what we're doing with that strategy is not so much supporting the TFG. It's not been a question of supporting support for the TFG. What we haven't done is incentivized the TFG to be functional. The TFG leadership has been able to play a role that we've seen in some other places where it's not a question of willing but not able, and we just need to build its capacity. It's unwilling and unable. And our continued financial support to that context is an instance of moral hazard in which we're reinforcing the very behavior that's at the root of the problem in the first place. Well, by diversifying your points of support in the country, you're ending the monopoly that the TFG has on governance. We're saying we will engage with anyone who is a legitimate source of governance in the country, and the TFG hopefully will be first among equals, but it needs to start to step up and govern. Or I think, and my own read is somewhat different than yours, David, and it'd be interesting to compare notes afterwards, but I get the sense that there are some fairly powerful combinations of states and actors out there who'd be willing to actually say no in August if there isn't progress. Now, that's not to say they have to end the transition. No one believes that they're going to complete all the transitional tasks between now and August. But I think there is a move to start creating some very clear tasks that have to be completed, key transitional tasks to show that they're serious about it. And these are tasks that wouldn't necessarily have to involve taking lots of territory. I think they're realistic.
I would just add that I agree with what Ken just said, even though I tried to accordion my remarks in just a few words by saying support for the TFG. TFG really is, in many respects, a bit of a figurehead, and if they want to continue to play the front man role, and the U.S. is certainly willing to support that, but clearly the U.S., as a result of this new policy announcement, is reaching out to other elements in Somalia. The question is, as Ted and I were talking during lunch, are we going to follow up with action and go beyond the words? It's one thing to say that the United States and the international community, theoretically, is going to start supporting clan leaders, sub-clan leaders, elders, other unnamed groups in South and Central Somalia, which is currently under al-Shabaab control at the moment. It's easy to say that, but following through is the hard part. And are the resources going to be there? Is the international community willing to move in with development assistance to back up presumably promises from some of these leaders to push back against al-Shabaab? And some of these groups have sizable militias that are essentially dormant. So all of this is good in theory, and I'm fully supportive of it, but it's got to be backed up with some very serious action, and not just by the United States, but by the international community collectively.
Unfortunately, we're about out of time, but I told Alan before I would end, I'm going to put 2 minutes of extra time on the clock. Alan, the web will get the last question.
Okay, this is from Stephen Dockery of the Center for a New American Security. This idea that al-Shabaab has a position on wanting to maintain a stalemate or wanting to impose a specific order, as if al-Shabaab were moments away from drafting a policy paper on the subject. Doesn't looking at al-Shabaab as a cohesive political party hamper our analysis of it? That such an amorphous organization that in many respects just holds on like the other Somalis hamper our analysis of this issue? Should we have a better way of dealing with ambiguity when it comes to Somali political parties?
Yes. Absolutely.
Good answer.
No, I mean, not to be facetious, but I hope none of us projected an image of Shabaab as a highly unified group. I mean, I think what we do know of it is it has lots of internal splits. Like most other Somali groups, I mean, you can deduce from any Somali organization they're going to have lots of fissures, lots of splits. This isn't a political environment that's very conducive to high levels of political hierarchy, and so I think that one of the plausible explanations for the protracted stalemate is also just not just an intentional desire for a stalemate, but a lot of indecision on their part. I mean, I think all of the action, including the United States, has been, we're all just looking at bad options and paralyzed by the bad choices we've got, and the status quo tends to rule then.
Yeah, the two things I'd add are, number one, that, I mean, obviously I agree with both the rather humorous comment and also Ken's response to it, but I do think also that you have a number of statements by Shabab leadership. Now, I'm not saying Shabab should be considered a unified actor. Everyone realizes that it's not. But they do have doctrine, and they do have ideology that's been laid out. And I think it's worth paying attention to what they're saying. Second thing is that if you have a substantial faction within Shabab that shares the view that Ken and I suspect that they may, i.e. a substantial faction that wants a stalemate, then using shorthand and saying Shabab may favor a stalemate, I think, well, it's a little inaccurate. It's not that inaccurate, because that, in fact, is the situation that you have right now. If you have enough people who want a stalemate within the organization, seeing it as beneficial, then it probably will persist for some time to come.
Well, thank you very much. I think we profitably could have spent at least another half hour to an hour talking about this. I know I still have some questions, but please join me in thanking the excellent panel today.